You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. On this episode, we're going to be hanging out with Jennifer from Sweden, and we're going to be taking a look at some of the most popular arguments for why goth music is the most, if not the only, important thing in our community. We'll also be touching on the idea of goth as a lifestyle and talking about goth as a youth subculture. Of course, we're also reviewing an album. We'll be looking at the new album from Double Echo. We've got Sinister Suggestions and a lot more. So as always, I am the Count, coming to you from my bat cave where I'm self-quarantined in the mountains. Jennifer, let's get into it. Talk a little about how you discovered goth, when you first decided you were goth, what that was like.
Mm-hmm. So for me, it really started with punk music. Sweden has a large punk scene, and I was introduced to it in middle school through a teacher, actually. This was in about 2002, so I was 12 years old. And when I found punk, it just struck something within me. It was everything that I was, very political and very angry. It just, it said so much. And through that, I started finding new music through this teacher, and also through my newly discovered love of the internet and streaming sites. And for me, some kind of breaking point was finding the band Killing Joke. That was the band that sort of changed everything. It led me from this very angry political punk music into the more romantic, darker stuff that I remember I found through The Damned and Joy Division, Susie, The Cure, Bauhaus, and later to more death rocky stuff like Christian Death, Southern Death Cult, and Alien Sex Fiend, those kinds of. And so I really found it through the music, but it took a few years for me, I think, really to understand that what I listened to and loved was called goth. And I remember seeing some pictures of Johnny Rotten and just thinking, okay, that's me now. And when I was 16 or 17, I shaved my first death hawk, and even to this day, I still find myself having one foot in the punk and one foot in the grave, in the goth subculture, and I love it there. That's where I belong. So yeah.
Yeah, I said our bunker earlier. I should have said our bat caves. Our self-isolating.
Yeah, you missed that. You missed that opportunity.
I'll fix that when I record the introduction for the show, I think.
Yeah, you do that.
And actually, I should ask you too, what kind of options you have there. Like, basically, what kind of scene, or do you have a scene there for goth or even industrial or metal or anything like that?
So yeah, first thing to remember is that I come from Sweden, which is a very, very small country located in the very north of Europe. It's about the size of the state of California, and the number of people is like in Chicago. So it's a very small country. And in my town, we're about 100,000 inhabitants. There are some rock bars, but only one alternative club about once a month. It's mostly EBM and aggro tech and people in fetish wear, which is not my cup of tea at all. None of those things are. Yeah. But it's important to support the local scene, and I've had some DJ gigs there, and I try to indoctrinate them as well as I can. And in Stockholm, which is the capital of Sweden, there's an amazing club called Club Död, which just means club death in Swedish.
Classic.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's amazing. It's run by a few friends of mine, and it keeps getting really big bookings of like classic goth rock, neo folk, post punk, and it's that's like the number one club in Sweden, and they are actually doing really great. Some of them can actually live off of this.
Wow.
So it's big. It's a big thing, and people from all over the country and all over Scandinavia travel there. So yeah, it exists. We're alive and kicking.
The main thing we're talking about today is a Reddit post that had, the main reason I wanted to talk about this is because it had, if I remember, I don't have the link anymore actually, but I'm pretty sure it had several hundred upvotes on Goth Reddit, which doesn't happen very often. So a lot of people seemed to agree with the content here, and I think a lot of it is debatable. So I wanted to talk about that. So let's just jump into this. This is basically a 6-point argument for. Well, let's see. What do they say at the beginning? I know that we talk about it a lot, but I wanted to take a moment to put down several reasons why music is the most important to the goth scene. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. And I guess for the record, I should point out that I do think goth music is very important. So just before anyone writes me an angry email when I start talking about the rest of this.
Yeah.
Cool. So the first point they have here says enjoying the music is not subjective. There's something called goth rock. You are a fan of it or you are not. It's that easy. When you start looking at people and trying to decide if they're dressed goth, one of 1,000 styles that are all fusions of other styles, or if they have a goth lifestyle, or they have a dark tendency in their soul, whatever that means, then that is subjective. If you start going by subjective criteria, then you start having people deciding that people they don't like for some reason can't have access to the scene, and declaring people posers when they are just as much music enthusiasts as the accuser. I have seen this happen, and I'm glad that the scene is largely beyond that now. Okay, so what do either of you think about it? Jennifer, you can go first if you want to, but I'm curious how you both feel about that.
Yeah, so I want to say in the beginning that yes, I think the music is the absolute majority, but it's this person is also simplifying this a lot. But the thing that struck me most was the last sentence. I have seen this happen, and I'm glad that the scene is largely beyond that now. I don't know where they got that from. Aren't we fighting this on the internet on a daily basis? Or so that's pretty interesting. I think that this is an ongoing thing, and you can talk about elitism and gatekeeping, but I think I somehow agree with this first thing. I mean, I keep struggling with being an elitist. Me and my friends are always joking about that. I am an elitist, and I'm trying to work on it. But for me, the Gothic subculture has meant so much to me and still does. And the fact that it is a music-based subculture is not something that I want to change per se. Perhaps I do want to make it more accessible and more open-minded. But it is the most important thing, and I think I can agree with the first point here.
Okay, good. I thought you would say that, and I'm excited to hear if you disagree with some of the things I have to say about this and why, because I think it would be nice to have that conversation with someone that I like instead of yelling at someone on the internet. Trey, how do you feel about that first bit?
So the underlying thrust saying that music is the most important element, or at least, a primary element of being part of the goth subculture, I don't necessarily disagree with. I don't agree with it wholeheartedly in that they are sort of pressing the idea that it's the only one that's important. But putting it on in a place of prominence, I don't disagree with. However, almost everything stated in here to defend that or to argue for it, I think is bordering nonsensical. Even the first line, enjoying the music is not subjective. Enjoying anything is subjective. That's the meaning of subjective. It's a person's opinion on a thing. So it's all subjectivity. There is nothing objective about enjoying something. And then as far as there's something called goth rock, there's also a lot of other things that people enjoy that are under that goth umbrella, as we kind of discussed in our last episode. There's a lot of music that is goth and enjoyed by goths, and enjoying that music is part of being goth, or is not at least something that prevents you from being goth. So while, yes, there is something called goth rock, it is not the only music for goths. And even still, it's also not as objective as they're kind of laying out here. There's plenty of people who will have arguments ad nauseum on what is and is not goth rock, what is and is not canon. So saying that's somehow more cut and dried than the nebulous realm of fashion or lifestyle is ridiculous. It's as contentious as fashion and lifestyle. It's as prone to mixing of different sounds and styles as the fashion. It's as, nebulous as what constitutes a Gothic lifestyle. So you could really say this exact same statement and flip around any of those three axes between lifestyle and fashion and music. I think you could say the same thing with fashion taking place of music and make these same statements, and it's still true, because they're all very subjective. None of them can be categorically determined as a single entity that's monolithic and completely objectively defined, that if you like it, you are goth. If you do not like it, you are not. So a lot of that doesn't seem to make any sense to me. I kind of like some of the stuff at the end where they're talking about how these various criteria can be used to judge people. And I'm not a fan of that in general. But I don't think people are any more likely to be judged and excluded based on their fashion sense than about their music literacy tests and whatnot when they don't know who the girlfriend of the third drummer of the greatest goth band in the world is. You can be excluded for anything like that, and that's no different for music, for lifestyle choices, or for fashion. It's just easier to judge on fashion from across the room, and that's fair, I guess. But that's sort of the only impetus of this whole first statement that I kind of think holds some water.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the thing, is if the criteria was just your music knowledge, then Bruce from We Have a Technical would be the only true goth in the world, and he's very, very clearly said he's not goth. So, but yeah, so going back to the objective thing, and to be fair, or to be honest, I guess, in my own sort of philosophy of the world, I don't think anything is truly objective. So, of course, I'm going to have a problem with that statement.
Yet you rail against postmodernism all the time.
Well, we'll get into I tried to explain that previously, but yeah. So the joke I made about this on Facebook was I said, "Is The Cure a goth band?" And that was kind of meant to be a intuition pump, I guess, to this idea that if goth music is objective, then every goth should have the same answer to that question. And obviously, if you've talked to goths, you know that they don't have the same answer to that question. And I think that just what you were saying, Trey, about negotiating what is and isn't goth music is kind of an ongoing process that develops and changes over time through more objective measures, right? Like musicological measures, but also discussion between people that call themselves goth. But the thing with musicology or studying music is that not I've read a few papers and books from that perspective, and not everyone necessarily agrees. They may agree very closely on, like, okay, how do we identify goth rock, and this is the definition we use, but they don't all necessarily agree on what a goth band is. Like, for example, the book I lent you, Trey, that I'm forgetting the name of, the goth music book.
Yeah, I remember it. I don't remember the title either.
Here it is. Gothic Music, The Sounds of the Uncanny.
Yes.
She tries to basically, in very, very academic language, tries to lay out a objective way of understanding goth music. But there's little oddities in there, like she calls Marilyn Manson a goth band, which, like, if you talk to goths, they're gonna disagree with you.
Except Joe.
So, yeah. Let's not rehash that trauma, please. So I think it's just it kind of points out that there are quantifiable aspects for understanding music, but it's not something that's static. I'm going to link a few academic papers in the show notes for this. One of the ones I want to share is a paper by Joshua Gunn, where he talks about the adjectival codes of genre. So basically what descriptive terms we use to describe a genre. And he explains how those are not the way that people use those aren't just some mathematical calculation. It's a communal discussion, and it's partly emotional, partly experiential, and that kind of thing. So, but that's, not to say that people don't disagree with me. Obviously, this person does, but a YouTuber, Mads the Ghost, just put out a video where they basically said the same thing as this person. Back when I used to have the audio clip for the philosophy corner of the show, there was a YouTuber from England who basically said the same thing, that, goth is music and everything else is an expression of an appreciation for that music, right? The clothing, the skulls and all that is just an appreciation for music, but it's more on the side when it comes to what it means to be goth. So I get that people don't agree with me, but I'm going to try and explain throughout this article, like, why I think the way I do. So, all right. So point 2, they say music is financially accessible. Because of the availability of music on the internet, you don't have to pay for access to the subculture. You have to pay for special clothes, makeup, boots, leather-bound poetry books, taxidermy crows to put on your mantle, or whatever else people expect you to have for your lifestyle. And that isn't fair to people who have other financial priorities. Love of goth music allows us to have a recognizable standard that allows us to recognize and relate to each other without putting up boundaries that are impossible to cross without money. So, Jennifer, having done several DIY YouTube videos, how do you feel about that?
Well, I got kind of pissed, actually. You might think that I agree with this, but it's so simplified, and it makes it sound like division between classes just has to do with finances, and it's not as easy as that. It also has to do with things like education and finding peers of your own. How do you say in English? Wait a second.
Peers, yeah, finding peers.
Yeah, and it all comes down to the information, what kind of information you have available. And it's I have a hard time finding the English words for this, but it's a common thing that you think that class perspective just has to do with economics, and it's not always about that. And saying that music is financially accessible no matter how much money you have is not really that easy. So I think what this person is trying to achieve by saying this, I get it.
Right.
But if you don't have that kind of people, those kinds of people around you, people with the same interests that can show you where to download or what kind of software you can play with to find these kinds of sounds, and if you don't have that, you also don't have the accessibility.
Right.
Do you understand
Yes.
what I'm trying to? Yeah.
Yeah. How do you feel about that, Trey?
Well, kind of like the first point, I kind of like the underlying sentiment behind it, the idea of we want to make the community and acceptance in the community something that's accessible to everybody. It's not being limited by class station, by race, ethnicity, location, whatever. We want to have people who are interested in the subculture, interested in everything surrounding goth and interacting and participating within that subculture. We want to make that available to people so they can, without putting up artificial barriers to entry. And I kind of get what they're saying with music being freely available, though that is a privileged position to take. I think Jennifer was touching on that a little bit as well, that it isn't free to access music for everybody in the world. You need access to the means to listen to the music, the means to play the music, the means to access it, even if you don't have to pay for the music itself once you have all of these secondary things, like a phone or an MP3 player or a computer or tape deck or whatever, internet
connection,
access,
electricity.
Yeah. Right. There's all these things that are required to access the music. Now, to access music in general, you're right. You don't need any of that. You just need a couple of rocks. You can bang them together. You got music. You just need a voice. You can sing. You've got music. So having music is freely available. Having produced goth music that gives you entry into the community, allows you to participate in the community in discussions of the music, that requires the ability to go to concerts or go to clubs or to download, buy, stream, whatever the music that's accepted by the community. So that is not the lowest bar to entry. I would argue fashion is the lowest bar to entry, because of the three things that are in contention here, clothing is the only thing that everybody all over the world pretty much needs, with very few exceptions. And you can then tailor that clothing to more of a Gothic aesthetic. And thus the clothing aspect is the most accessible to everybody. And yes, they're arguing against the fast fashion arguments and, the high fashion brands, the prepackaged goth in a box costumes. Those things aren't accessible to people, but everybody needs clothing. Everybody can modify their clothing, adjust it DIY, and make the clothing their own and make that a goth aesthetic. So that is the one that has the most easy accessibility. So again, I like the argument that it's good to make it accessible, make participation in goth something that isn't beholden on class, but I don't think music is the guarantee for that.
Yeah, actually, that reminded me. I had this is a few years ago now, but I have a friend who is goth, and at one point they ended up being homeless, and they were homeless for quite a while. And they were asking people to, I don't remember if they asked me directly or if it was just on Twitter or something, but I ended up sending them a link to a Dropbox folder full of music, because they had a cell phone and they could go somewhere that had free Wi-Fi, but they couldn't, they can't pay for Spotify or whatever. And this was before, this must have been more than a few years ago. This was before Bandcamp was really popular. And so they were saying, Google Drive is free, Dropbox is free. If you can just throw a bunch of music in there, I can go somewhere and stream it. But that because they were, being homeless limits your access to stuff, and they weren't carrying around, a suitcase of records or whatever. So it's not necessarily just free, and that's just part of living in a capitalist culture. If you aren't homeless, there's a lot of stuff underlying your way of life that you maybe don't necessarily think about. And it seems silly to me that, because obviously this person is attacking Killstar and Blackcraft and whatever, but I feel like it's strange you would just completely overlook thrifting at all. In the 80s, if you like, Andy Harriman's book talks about people making their own hair dye and making their own clothes out of old curtains and stuff like that. But you can go thrifting and DIY clothing now and spend very little, if any, money. So I don't think the argument that music is the only thing that's free makes any sense.
No.
And
I,
go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just hate the fact that I can't express myself in the way that you can, because a lot of the things you say are exactly the same things I want to say. And one of the things I've thought about during reading this article was also the fact that the financial aspect of being a part of the more elitist group of goths, including myself, who say that it's important to go to shows and it's important to go to clubs and support them and be a part of the scene. But that's also an economic aspect. It costs money to do that.
Yeah.
And that's also something that they have not brought up in this article.
And a lot of, considering, if you are someone who, like this, I assume this person, I mean, they don't really talk about it, so I can't assume. But if you are only getting your music for free, a lot of the posts on Facebook that I've seen recently have been talking about how musicians are struggling now because all of the festivals are getting canceled and all of the shows are getting canceled because of COVID-19. And a lot of people are saying, hey, if you want to support a band, please go order a copy of their album. Please go buy their record on Bandcamp or buy some shirts or something like that. So there's another aspect here that if you're too heavily promoting music as a free access thing, then you're not supporting the people making that music, which is a problem, because then they're not going to be able to make the music. And if you think that's the main part of goth, I think spending money on that would be important to you. But yeah. All right. So next point, they say a lot of the crazy goth point nonsense is very cultural specific. For example, goths have picnics in cemeteries. You know who else does? Millions of people in different cultures around the world. I'm from the US, and I grew up hanging out in cemeteries because that is the culture from the city that I came from. We cannot gauge someone's gothness by things that are not specific to goth, and a lot of death and morbidity practices that people associate with goth aren't.
Yeah, I find it interesting that having picnics in cemeteries would give you goth points. I don't know if that's because of the part of the world I'm from, where it's freezing cold all the time. But we don't have access to having picnics in cemeteries, and also it's not allowed in a lot of places. You're barely allowed to go through there if you don't know someone who died.
Well, that's where the punk rock part comes in, where you just go at night. and
Yeah,
do it anyway.
absolutely.
Break the rules, man.
Absolutely. True story, though. But I actually have a hard time trying to figure out, is it that having picnics in cemeteries is a silly way of getting goth points when you can access music through the internet instead, or what are they trying to say?
I think what they're trying to say is that goth music is the only thing that is unique and specific to goth, and that anything else, clothing, lifestyle stuff like going to a cemetery, that gothic literature or whatever, goth movies, that people that aren't goth enjoy those things. So you can't say that that's truly what it means to be goth, because people that aren't goth do those things.
Then yeah, I was afraid that was the point.
Yeah.
I had higher hopes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least that's what I got out of that.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that's what I got out of it as well. I think it was a fairly weak argument, non sequitur, really. It's only kind of true as well, because I think they don't mention it in the point, but I think the subtext is that, as you said, goth music is unique to goths, and only goths like goth music. I know an awful lot of people who are not goths and will never claim to be goths who are going to disagree with that. You've already mentioned Bruce Lord, as someone very well informed and enjoys the music, but nor does he want to be considered goth.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty much anything that one could use to point out a goth is something that is not unique to goth exclusively. There's all kinds of intermixing of different subcultures and different cultures that like and participate and do aspects of goth. This is a good time to plug your homology hypothesis, because that does sort of counteract that, in that it's not just any one thing. It's not just the music or just having picnics in cemeteries, or the more popular one in the goth tests from the 90s, fucking in cemeteries.
Yeah.
That usually was a lot more goth points than just visiting or having a picnic in them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think there's any single one criteria that you could say, oh, this is so unique that only people who are goths, true goths, like this one thing. So if you meet someone who likes or has or does this one thing, then you know you've met a true goth. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do like that they've at least considered some cultural relativity here.
Mm-hmm.
But I would, as I kind of alluded to, I would always say that everything is culturally or contextually specific, and there isn't anything that can exist outside of that understanding of it. You brought up Bruce Lord. I have brought up someone I work with on a couple episodes, who I can talk with him about Clan of Zymox and Susie and Bauhaus and the Sisters and whoever for hours, but he's just for all intents and purposes, just a normal person who just happens to like goth music. So it's not some purist, category that never interacts with anything else. And I think you kind of have to be honest about that if you're going to make an argument. I think what this person does a lot is make a claim and then never explain how they got to that point. Like, okay, goth music is objective. Okay, so tell me what the objective standards are. Because if it's objective, that means you can measure it, you can quantify it. So then tell me what it is then. Mm-hmm. And I get it. I get this as a Reddit post, but you have to have some degree of explanation. You can't just say the sky is purple and therefore, I have warts on my butthole. Like, you explain how you got from point A to point B. And yeah, I was going to bring up the homology hypothesis as well, but you did it for me, so thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, number 4. There are cases where people use the stereotypical aesthetics of goth as a way to display prejudices from the mainstream world, specifically racism, trans erasure, and sizeism. Taking the power away from how someone looks and focusing on music takes away the ability for people to argue such horrid and outdated things. And I feel like I shouldn't need to say this, but I will. Racism, sizeism, transphobia, homophobia, ageism, ableism, sexism, and all that other nonsense do not belong in goth, period. End of discussion.
Yeah, so I have no arguments there. It's a pretty weak argument because, of course, it shouldn't belong there. But also, I come to think of I won't say her name, but she's a very big Swedish
I know who you're talking about.
/ synth icon. Yeah, I won't say her name, but you know her.
Yep.
Who is constantly representing the Swedish goth community, which is nightmarish to me. She always she uses Nazi symbols. She's been in Germany doing the
Yep.
The
Hitler mustache.
thing with the hand,
Yep.
The Hitler mustache. So when I first read this bullet point, I thought, yeah, of course, no problem there. Everyone I know is trans or non-binary. But then I thought, yeah, the people representing the subculture on the internet, the big people with a huge following, they are still extremely problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And so, sadly enough, that's a fight I keep having with this person on online forums, and I keep getting blocked, and I love it. I won't ever give up.
Beautiful. Are those specifically Swedish forums or just any?
Yeah, it's a closed Swedish forum for people who are female or non-binary within the Swedish subculture. But I've got print screens. I got the receipt.
That's interesting. Is she still part of the discussion around goth in Sweden? Because I know she had some popularity here for a while, but nobody that I know gives a shit about her anymore in the US.
Great.
At least.
Great. I love to hear that. It's interesting because the newer people from, let's say, they could almost be my children. I mean, I'm almost 30, so people like 16, 17 coming into the subculture, they know who she is and they look up to her and they listen to what she says. Yep, because they still know who she is. She keeps popping up on Google if you search for Swedish goths. So it's sadly enough, it's an ongoing problem, and that's also a part of why I think it's so important that I keep being bitchy and that I keep questioning everything she says. It's not for me to personally attack her. Okay, it's a little bit, but mostly it's to show these new people coming in that she is not allowed to keep saying these things without being criticized or questioned. And that also comes back to the point of this this statement in the Reddit post as well. Yeah, at a first glance we're all androgynous and beautiful, but underneath there are rotten roots.
Yeah. What if you can't think of any, that's fine. I'll just cut this out of the episode. I don't want to put you on the spot. But do you have suggestions for other places, maybe specific people or other places that goths in Sweden can get information from or videos from or whatever other than that one person?
I am one of those people.
Yes, of course, yes.
But also, I think that this group is actually pretty good. Since she hardly posts there anymore because I keep bitching. That is kind of not a safe place, but it's one place where people can promote their clubs and their gigs, and hey, I'm about to DJ in this town, and there are some meetups and things like that. So I think it's that group is probably the best we have right now. It's called Alternative Chicks Sweden.
Okay.
And it's yeah.
And actually, I should just ask you right now, since I completely forgot to ask you at the very beginning, but where do you tell us like what people should search for on YouTube and other places to find you?
Yeah, okay. So Jennifer Groke is my username on most platforms. It's on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. And I keep having video ideas of things I want to talk about, and I'm a very political person in Swedish. I just have a hard time talking about these things in a language that's not my
Right.
own.
Yeah.
But I think it's really, really important that some of us are there and that we can show that, hey, I'm non-binary, I'm not scary at all, I'd love to help. I mean, just a few months ago, someone wrote to me who was from the US somewhere. He had there were strict guidelines for how they were allowed to dress in school, which is very foreign to me, since in Sweden you can look however the fuck you want. But here there were certain rules, and he asked, how can I make my own battle jacket without having spikes and studs, because those are against the guidelines. And I love those kinds of questions because I can give tips and tricks as to how to go around these rules, and that's the way I live my life. It's like, how do you bend the rules? How do you teach the younger children how to bend the rules?
Right. Let me ask you about politics in a second here, since this is relevant to what we're talking about, but I will just mention that I will have links to those in the show notes. So if anyone is, whoever's listening, I suggest you, especially YouTube, check out those videos. It's one of the channels that I enjoy watching because the content is interesting. You have a great personality and you present the information in an easy to understand way without a lot of, other stuff.
And you're talking about me right now.
Yeah.
Wow,
I do.
you.
So so anyone listening, definitely go take a look at their YouTube channel and see, check out a couple videos. I think they're really helpful. But since you brought up politics, I would be curious to ask if there is any crossover for you with being a goth and your political opinions, or if those are kind of two separate categories.
That's interesting because I had a dinner with some friends last weekend, and we talked about. We kind of all agreed that there are two groups of goths. That's the left-wing goths and the right-wing goths, in Sweden at least. And I'm, as you can guess, I'm part of the left-wing goth because I come from the punk roots, being also brought up by my mother as an angry feminist and an atheist that comes with certain, political views. And it was very easy for me to get into the goth music because, as I said, Killing Joke, they're very political. But I have had fights with other goths who are more right-wing, kind of Death in June
Mm.
fans, you know, the kind.
Yeah,
And that
racists.
can cause problems. Yeah, racist. Yeah, absolutely. And that can cause problems. Absolutely. But as far as Sweden goes, it's a very small community. Most of us know each other, and the kind of dark wave, post-punk, death rock, we are on the left side, and then there are the more neo-folk, synth, electronica. Not all of them, obviously, but there is kind of a divide between us, definitely.
Well, Trey, what do you think about any of that, or the article specifically?
Well, I mean, there was
I've got a few
lot
thoughts.
of things
I
happening there.
let you go. Yeah.
But as far as back to the article, I mean, I don't disagree that there are stereotypes around what it is to be goth that can lead to people having racist, ableist, sizist, ageist, whatever views. Certainly, those are wrong and an improper interpretation of the style. But there's also aspects of the music that could be interpreted the same way. Already mentioned acts like Death in June that have some ideological problems, and there have been others. I mean, there's also the fact that the vast majority of the major goth bands are white Western society bands. They're not, there's no staple from Asia or staple band from South Africa or anything like that. So, I mean, you could be racist just liking the music too, because none of the music you like comes from a different racial or cultural background than that sort of Western European. That's not to say that all the music is that way, but certainly the Godfathers, the big bands that everybody knows and points out, are fairly culturally homogenous. So the music isn't immune to that either. But, you know, again, the underlying message behind this, the fact that none of these isms are part of the goth experience or should be part of the goth experience, I agree with, but there's also the fact that they are part of the goth experience. All of these things happen within the subculture and needs to be confronted. And if your stance is that they shouldn't exist and therefore refuse to look at things that might encourage them, then you're not confronting the issue and you're not helping solve that problem.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, going back to what Jennifer was talking about, that it's interesting to hear you talk about kind of two different types of goths, because I certainly have blocked my fair share of bigots that were goth or punk on Facebook and other places. But I feel like in America, and I'm sure this just goes right back to the, culturally specific. Everything is that a cat?
Yes, my cat is
Kitty.
interrupting the podcast.
Little baby.
Oh no, not a baby, but definitely a kitty.
I feel like it's less of a problem in America because I think there's a big push to just get those people out of the community, which is great. But
yeah.
But also I think what kind of back to what you were talking about, Trey, we have to recognize that both that this can happen in music, and that has been, like, if you don't think we've had sexist or racist bands, then that's its own problem.
Wake the fuck up.
Yeah, that's its own problem.
Yeah.
But also that we have to recognize that all these bigoted things he mentioned, racism, sizeism, etc., it's not just a mainstream thing, and that potential to be a bigot exists for everybody, and we have to be aware of that. Otherwise we're going to miss it when it happens, that it can be part of anything and everything. And also just, I think the idea, again, not to say it hasn't happened with fashion, but the idea that goth fashion more often than not is a problem because it promotes problematic views is silly, because I think at least in my experience, when you ask someone why they dress the way they do, a lot of the answers I get are, if it's not about music, it's a rejection of mainstream norms, right? A lot of people are saying this is a way of subverting or rejecting the way other people want me to behave or act or look. And part of doing that means that you are then normalizing diverse body types, diverse gender expressions. And so I think most of the time, what people think of as goth style is doing the opposite of what this person is saying they have a problem with. So it was a little strange to me to use that example, but yes, obviously. And I even this weekend, last week, I had to put this on the Cemetery Confessions page because I posted something and we were getting transphobic comments, and I was banning people, and I was saying, yeah, if you don't think trans men are men and you don't think non-binary people are valid, we don't want you in our community, and that's the end of that. So I think that is important to say. All right, let's move on. Okay, number 5. One thing that the media often points out that is actually true is that goth is a youth subculture that tends to hang on to members better than other youth subcultures. Though I'd argue that metalheads tend to stick around in their lifestyle for a long time too. A big reason for this is that being music-based, we don't just boot people who can't maintain the lifestyle or even participate a lot in the community when their life gets hectic. I'm in my mid-40s, and most people I know in the scene are around my age, and they took one or more breaks from the scene because of kids, career, or other reasons. The fact that people can drop out and come back is one of the huge contributors to the longevity and success of the scene, and the reason that people will want to come back is because of the music, and friends, and getting together with friends to listen to music. But the friendship started from common love of the music.
Yeah, once again, I'm starting to feel like a broken record, but it's so, this person is really trying to make it sound so simple. I don't know. I can't agree with the fact that the music is the reason why people drop out and come back. It's because of these 3 pillars that are the music and of course, but also the community and the way you find each other. And I don't think that, I love Sisters of Mercy, so now that my child is 10 years old, I can come back. I don't think I can't agree with that.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people that leave goth, well, let me not generalize so much. The people I've talked to that at some point in their life have left goth, even though they wanted to be goth, were because of they felt like they couldn't be seen as an adult either in a relationship or at a job and still be goth, and they felt like society forced them out of doing that. And that isn't, so they could still listen to music, but it was more of the performative or outward aspects of goth and the way they dress, their behaviors, like going to a concert or a club, that kind of thing. But I have a lot to say about this. So Trey, what are your thoughts on this one?
Kind of pretty much the same thing. I mean, the music is good, and you're right. It's something that you can have acquired in your youth, and then you own it, providing you bought it on records or CDs or tape or whatever. Being a 40-year-old, probably all of the above. And sure, you can keep listening to the music and you can keep enjoying it. And maybe that would bring you back. But that doesn't mean that you wouldn't necessarily have enjoyed the clothing and that brought you back as you go join your Stitch and Bitch club or go on a DIY thrifting group with other people. There are plenty of community aspects to the other pillars of the community. So I don't think music is noteworthy in that sense. And I'd say the biggest counterexample is, thinking of a youth subculture that is, in my opinion, even more entirely based on music. We'd look at the rave or EDM subcultures, which are, as far as I know, entirely music-based.
And probably drugs.
Possibly too. Possibly the drugs too. You're right. There could be an activity.
Although I guess
but that's part of
you can
the
be straight
experience.
edge and yeah.
You can be, but that's also part of the clubbing and music experiencing. That's part of the experience. And those are not subcultures that hold on to people. There are not that many people who age and remain part of that community. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it shifts so frequently too. There's always new styles coming up that are the hot thing in the clubs. I mean, I mentioned rave and show my age because that's not even a thing and hasn't been for probably 2 decades now. But that's definitely a music-based subculture, and that the love of that music does not seem to keep people in that subculture. Whenever I've been to the handful of events I've been to at like an electronic festival or something focused like that, it's a lot of kids. People over their mid-20s are not really common. And that's a big difference from when I go out to events in goth clubs. So I don't think being a musical subculture makes it more robust and aids longevity. I'd say having a wider scope that defines goth is what leads to that longevity. Because if you can no longer go out to clubs and concerts, you can still, enjoy the aesthetic of the clothing or try to live the lifestyle or do what you can within or just participate in the culture, be it online or at local meetups, things like that. There's lots of things you can do. And what facilitates that is having a broader scope that defines the subculture than just participating in the music side of it.
I want to talk about youth culture here for a second because first of all, I feel like he kind of defeats his own point. This is another time where, sorry, I said he, whoever this is, they bring up a assertment in the first sentence and then never explain it. And then I feel like they defeat their own argument in the second part of it because they say goth is a youth culture. Also, I'm in my mid-40s and people are fine with me being involved. Those two things don't make sense coming together. Like what you were saying, Trey, when you have it, youth subcultures would be more considered groups where they prioritize youth, and you can't really get back into those scenes. And I've actually seen like TikToks and other memes from people in their 30s and above about this, where they try and go to whatever kind of club they would normally go to when they were in college and feeling like they have nothing in common with anyone there. And, all the priorities in their life are completely different. And then they get looked down on by the younger people there because they're older. And that is a common experience, I think, for other groups. But because goth is not a youth subculture, it makes it easier for... And also the idea of subcultural capital, where you can, if you're in your 50s and 60s, you can accrue a whole lot of respect as a pillar of the community for having been around in and supporting the scene for that long, whereas you don't really get that with other, even EDM, the DJs, you don't really necessarily age as a DJ unless you are like one of the founders of the genre. Where you basically cycle out and you just have younger, a certain age group of people playing festivals and stuff. So the idea, I think they got one thing right, is that it's a label generally applied by the media. Personally, I think that's because they like to have flashy headlines about, look at what weird shit the kids are doing these days. But I don't think it has any practical or theoretical application. The way, at least for goth, I think sociologists that do use a youth culture framework are talking about eboys and e-girls and VSCO girls right now. And actually, You know what? I'll put a link in the show notes as well. I think I have an article link about this very thing that I can, if you're interested in either of those,
Sure.
a sociologist's opinion of that, I will share it. But I think it's interesting again at the end, and Jennifer, you brought this up, that when they're writing this as a defense for music, but they invoke community and then try to rectify the two. And I don't think that's insignificant because, you can sit around your house and listen to music, but there is something about goth music that draws people together. And I think the material interaction, the in-person experience and relationship is meaningful, is substantial, metaphysically substantial, and I think necessary in the creation of what we call goth. I don't think you can just assume friendship and community. I think the music and the community are related and interactive with each other, and you can't have one without the other. You can't separate music from community in the context of goth and have them make any sense anymore, because now that they have been separated from each other, they kind of lose meaning, because I think those two rely on interacting to create goth, basically. So I think that's important. To just kind of very, very quickly, and this is where I'll have another one or two academic articles linked that will explain the history of this in much greater detail if you are interested in that. But the history of the term youth subculture was something that came out of the 60s with the CCCS School of Sociology, and it was a way of describing the communities that kids were forming. And the argument was that these groups did not exist before World War II, because pre-World War II, the idea was that kids were pushed into capitalism and adulthood as soon as possible. So there was no developmental period where they could experiment and find their identity separate from their utility to society. And so that framework, and this goes back to our Evolution of Goth episode where I talked about this in depth, but that framework itself of understanding groups within a sociological field is largely neo-Marxist and structuralist, which basically what that means is it's a way of understanding subculture as resistance to hegemonic forces or, broader cultural forces. And those forces are assumed to be inbuilt structures that guide human behavior. And because of that, this goes back to what Jennifer was saying a while ago, it sees youth subcultures as being defined by class and social conflict. So like punk is a classic example of this view of subculture, because it's the most cut and dry within a specific historical context of a class and social conflict relationship between a group of people and mainstream communities. But I don't think a lot of sociologists really, some do, which is why that book we read had a lot of that in there that we reviewed in that episode.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of sociologists, I don't think, fewer sociologists use that framework anymore because it has a lot of flaws.
I'd certainly say they don't use that framework as a whole. Like, this is the entire explanation. They may have aspects of it. They may grab points from it because it does still have some value. But saying this is the general theory of sociology that meets every need has been shown to be a significantly flawed viewpoint nowadays.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to the last point here, which is number 6. And they say the music gives us something that's common ground. I have conversations with people from countries all over the world who I would not have met if it wasn't for the common love of goth music. It gives us a reason to meet at a bar together, a reason to meet people online, a reason to have discussions. As I travel, I take any chance I can to stop in at goth nights and clubs, and when I'm there, I can have conversations with total strangers about music, and we have a common ground, even though we may have nothing else in common. That really is a beautiful thing, a magical thing. Jennifer, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's hard to argue against. It's very hard to argue against someone's personal anecdotes. Like, I have conversations with people from other countries. Like, yeah, sure, you can have that. But I mostly agree. I think about Wave Gothic Treffen, which is my absolute favorite festival. It's absolute magic, and I travel there mostly for the music, but it's also absolutely not just about music. It's about the experience. It's about the community that we talked about. It wouldn't be as amazing of a festival if it wasn't for the community and the way people dress up and are comfortable enough to talk to each other and share common grounds in a place that's far from home, perhaps in another environment where they are the only place where some people are able to express themselves. Like, I have friends from Egypt who would be beat down in the streets if they wore the things at home that they wear to VGT. So absolutely, it's a common ground, but it's, once again, not just about the music. The music has created the community that we love, and that is a beautiful, magical thing. It's not just the music.
I think you described that perfectly. I don't know if I have anything to add to that. Do you have any other thoughts, Trey?
I mean, yeah, I mostly agree, but I think that can also be said of, as already mentioned with VGT, it's also a fashion exposition, and you can have those same conversations about fashion and about aesthetic. It's a little harder lifestyle that is more a private, ongoing thing, usually around where you live, so that's not something you typically display out at a public venue. But you can have those conversations about music, you can have it about fashion, you can have it about literature, you can have it about cinema, you can have it about anything as long as you have a venue. And the only argument that supports music here is that the predominant common venues that you can always look up and always go when you're in a place you don't know are clubs playing the music. So they create a space to have these conversations, perhaps, but it's not the guarantee or guarantor of the conversation itself happening. That can be about any aspect of the scene, and if you're at a goth club, you have a fair chance of having those conversations about any one of those topics with multiple people in that club.
Well, let me ask Jennifer this, because they're the only one who has been to VGT of the three of us. One of the arguments I've heard is, for someone like me who only gets to watch videos and see pictures of the festival, that it appears to be about fashion because that's the only thing people take photos or videos of. And that if you were actually there, you would see that most people aren't dressed up. Do you think like that's a good argument, or?
It's totally true, and I actually have been playing in my mind with the thought that I should make a video about this, because the picture that people get about Wave Gothic Treffen is not necessarily the truth, or it's not that for me. For some, for some people they use it as a runway, and of course you can do that. But for me, I was afraid of going there for a very long time because I thought that I would be looked at the wrong way, laughed at because I didn't have a big enough hawk, or I wasn't thin enough, and that's not the case. I have experienced nothing but love at that festival, and I've been, is it 7 or 8 times now? the age, how do you say? Most people are over, well over 30, perhaps well over 40 as well. It's extremely nice, even in the mosh pits. If someone falls, everyone stops and picks them up. It's, as I said, it's mostly about the community, and the things you see on YouTube are the aesthetic side, and that's kind of sad because it's not about that.
All right. Cool. Yeah, I don't think I can add anything more interesting to that. So let's we'll wrap up with the album review and then Sinister Suggestions.
Album review.
So this month we are reviewing the most recent album from Double Echo, and it is titled Burning in Blue. If you don't know, Double Echo began in 2012 as a studio collaboration between Chris and Ash that set out to this is their bio, that set out to remystify the forgotten practices of post-punk and primitive soundtrack electronica in the guise of a lost band from 1982 whose demo tape 4AD never got around to listening to. Their first release, the Black Morning EP, invited listeners to dream of another world of floating Casio keyboards and Sad Lovers and Giants guitars, demonstrating that there should be more Sad Lovers and Giants references in general. I'm just going to throw that out there.
Yeah.
Demonstrating that their commitment to 80s authenticity went deeper than merely an aesthetic gimmick and found Double Echo a cult following on Bandcamp. So we are going to play a track from the album, and I am going to play The Position.
I can just add that I actually just found Double Echo a few weeks ago while playing Sad Lovers and Giants
Oh,
to a
really?
friend. And they said, if you love this, you'll love this. And then played
Oh, wow.
Double Echo. So it's a new band for me, but I have fallen head over heels in love.
So I, in general, really like the album. I thought it had a really good sound. The thing I liked the most about it was the instrumentals. I love the synth work. When they had the guitar and bass work was nice. So I like the instrumental work throughout quite a lot, and that's really what drew me into it. The only thing I didn't really like is I'm generally getting a little sick of vocals so drenched in reverb that you can't really make them out. As much as I do like dream pop and other things like that that are based almost entirely around that, I think in something like this, the vocals do need to be brought up a little bit more. I'd say the second track and the last track were the only ones with vocals where they were appropriately placed. Maybe still a little too much reverb, but I thought they were pretty good. But a lot of the other ones were, listening to the singer on the other end of a sewer pipe. And it was too much for my tastes. And I know that's a thing. I feel like that was more of a 90s thing than an 80s thing, really. Or at least that's what I associate more with the 90s era of the more ethereal goth music than I do the 80s more just following post-punk side of things. But that's really was my only complaint, is I didn't necessarily care for the vocals because the reverb just kind of erases all the uniqueness of various singers. So they just kind of get homogenized down to one reverby, either male or female voice, instead of having all that unique character that I tend to enjoy when it comes to vocalists. But despite that, the band is really good. I definitely liked this album. I did listen to their previous album as well, just to kind of get a taste for some of their other work. I thought this album was a significant improvement, both in just sound quality as well as, from my standpoint, eclecticism. They definitely broadened their sound, brought in more elements, had a more interesting and diverse amount of music where, in the post-punk revival, a lot of the stuff that's been happening in post-punk is like they take a post-punk band and just make something that sounds very similar to that band. Whereas post-punk, when it was out, was really about a very, very broad and diverse concept of what constitutes music. And I think this band is starting to move in that direction where they're taking some of those more eclectic influences and playing with them and making of them a more interesting project that touches on a lot of that variety. But I really did love the instrumentals. A lot of that is very 80s synth-based soundtracks, so a lot of nostalgia there. I've also been listening to a fair amount of vaporwave, synthwave, dark synth stuff right now, which harkens to that same sort of 80s nostalgia. So I was kind of primed for this kind of a sound from that as well.
Cool. So my thoughts on the album. So this is one of my favorite albums of the last few years, I must say, just up front. It's got everything that I love about goth music the most. It's moody, it's haunting, and it's melancholy. Like you said, Trey, it doesn't get boring. I've found, specifically the first time I listened through the album, I would get to the end of a track and think, okay, I need to hear something different. If this next song is just going to sound like the song I just listened to, I'm going to be bored. But whenever I would get to that point, the next track would start and it would be something different that was also very good in its own way. So just to talk about a few of the songs on the album, the first two tracks were everything I love about 80s retrofuturism, in that it's not necessarily authentically 80s, like something you would hear in the 80s, but it is our perception of what something you would hear in the 80s is. So I really, really like that. The third track then gets into being more dancey and upbeat. I felt like that one was more reminiscent of a Drab Majesty song, so I really enjoyed that. And then you go to track 4, which changes it up again, and it has a really heavy bass line, which it has that more reminiscent of the post-punk sound, as some of that flangy. See, I can't even speak English correctly. Flangy 80s goth guitar, and then that's the first time that they switched the vocalist as well. But I think did you have a preference for either vocalist, or was it just both too echoey, Trey?
They were kind of both too echoey. I'm trying to remember. I think track 2 had the female vocalist. I don't remember. Do you remember if Burning in Blue was that the male or the female vocalist?
I think it was the male vocalist. Yeah, it was.
So yeah, it was really more about the vocal processing than the vocalist. Oh no, you're definitely right. It was the male vocalist. Because I remember, what was I thinking? I was thinking of something along in that one that the voice and the vocal qualities reminded me of. But of course, I'm blanking on it now that I'm talking about it. But I really did enjoy those 2 tracks, but it was more about the vocal processing. The vocalist was closer to me as I was hearing them, and I could tell the nuance of their voice, where the other ones, just drenched in that wash of reverb, lost all of that vocal nuance. So it didn't really matter which of the 2 vocalists were singing. It was all about the processing. I mean, in general, I do gravitate towards, I guess, female vocalists for some reason, though I also do like a good bass baritone voice. But that's more being selfish.
So then what else did I have to say? Oh yeah, so I really like the interlude tracks, the first one and the what were they called?
Screen 2 and
Screen
2,
something like that.
Yep.
Because those are just the really densely atmospheric.
Those were the cinematic soundtrack
songs.
Type.
Yeah, which is
songs.
And I thought The Watch was similar to that. There was singing on that one, but I wrote down, I felt when I was listening to this song that it makes me feel like I'm wandering through a fog-drenched, moon-soaked cemetery, and that's what I want to feel when I listen to goth music. But yeah, and then overall, I thought the album was superb. I thought it was specifically a very good example of how to emulate a distinct sound throughout an album while still remaining dynamic and not overstaying your welcome. I think that was the same problem I had with their previous album, was it all just kind of sounded the same.
Yeah.
Which gets boring. And I think this is also makes a great argument, going back to our EP versus LP discussion when we interviewed Trevor, of this. I think this makes a good argument for why an album is a good thing, because I don't think if you broke this down into singles, I don't think any of these songs would have the impact that they have as listening to it as an entire album. I think the experience of the whole thing is what makes this really, really good. Not to say that it doesn't have some of those like more pop sensibilities. Like I've been Burning in Blue has been stuck in my head for a couple days, kind of humming that melody and stuff. So it does have that aspect to it, but I think taken as a whole, it's a whole different experience.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
I have one of the greatest current Swedish post-punk goth bands just released a new album. The band is called Then Comes Silence, and they have just a week ago released a new album called Machine, which I really recommend checking out.
I haven't listened. I didn't realize they had a new album out. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will pull that up and listen to that today.
do that. I'm kind of biased because the drummer is a friend of mine, but it's an amazing band, and I've played some of their songs at when I'm DJing, and people always come up to me and say, "What is this? I've never heard it." And, it's great.
Awesome. Trey, what do you got?
I'm going to go with a musical act as well. This is one that I discovered via YouTube that I was fairly impressed by. It's a band out of the UK, I believe. Yeah, London, UK. Band is HMLTD. They came out with a new album called West of Eden. It's actually their debut album.
HML. Okay.
So they're an interesting band. They are kind of along the post-punk revival, though, again, they're very much carrying on that eclectic tradition, and they're not just hearkening back. They're sort of taking the old and merging it in with some of the new. So you've got some stuff that's, the standard post-punk or synth pop or little goth rock type things, but mixed in with a little bit more modern country or trap or, other modern styles of music. So they sort of are taking elements and mashing them together. And I think they do it in a very interesting and unique way. So I've been enjoying their album West of Eden.
Awesome. I'll have to look that up too. I didn't think about this question until just now. I don't know how I managed to do that. But so I don't have any music recommendations. I can mention a few things I've watched recently that I enjoyed, which are probably not obscure at all, but the new season of Castlevania on Netflix, I just finished last night. Fantastic. If you haven't watched any of it, I highly recommend checking it out. I think the third season is just as good as the first season, which I thought was amazing. And then what else did I watch? Oh, Altered Carbon, also on Netflix. That's like a dystopian sci-fi, kind of Blade Runner-esque show, but it's more focused on class disparities and governmental abuse, set in the distant future. I think that's a really good show, and Edgar Allan Poe is in it, so that's well, not literally, but someone plays a AI that bases their character off of Edgar Allan Poe, but he does a really good job playing that character. So
yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, I love it. There is some like Sci-Fi Channel cheesiness to it, but it's not a lot. I think otherwise it's pretty good quality. What else? I'm almost done with My Hero Academia, to throw back to a suggestion you had on a previous episode. Really enjoying that.
I'm still caught up on it, so I watched my episode this weekend.
Yeah, I think I'm on episode 60, so I'm not quite there yet. But
well, good, you can still binge it, because right now it's just getting frustrating because I watch an episode and it just ends. And like, wait, but more happening.
Yeah, especially now being quarantined, we need stuff to binge. Yeah, I don't know what else. I think I recommended Phantoms, the new Death Rock book, on a previous episode. I've still been reading that. That's really good. Yeah, I think that's good enough.
Yeah, I mean, you recommended more than I did. So,
So that's it. Jennifer, let us know one more time where people can find you on the internet.
Okay, so it's Jennifer Groke, and I'm on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook.
Beautiful.
You can find me there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for hanging out.
Thank you. It was an honor.
I made a brief reference to this at the beginning of the show, but as all of you are aware, many of us are now self-quarantined and are dealing with some serious changes in our day-to-day lives. There was some extended conversation about this when we recorded the episode, which Patreon members who can see the live streams will have been a part of. But I just wanted to take a moment to talk about a couple things. First of all, for the social aspect, if you are one of the people who are at home, if you aren't one of the essential workers working at grocery stores, healthcare, those kinds of jobs that we cannot do without, first of all, thank you so much for everything you're doing. And of course, and please take care of yourself. And for those who are either working from home or who have been put out of a job, which is a very unfortunate reality and a lot of people are dealing with right now. If you're looking for community, a lot of live streams, hangouts, film watching events, and that kind of thing have been popping up. So one of the good resources you can get on Facebook, there's a group called Gothic Streaming Events. People have been posting in that group streams that come up. You can also follow Obscura Undead, Angela Benedict. Other YouTubers are doing live streams that you can get in on. I know some DJs are doing live streams as well. Club events, some people I'd never heard of. Here in Chicago, I know Darkwave is holding a virtual club event, and Nocturna on April 4th is doing a live club event as well. That'll be live streamed. So there are ways to get in touch, to get involved, and to stay connected with other people. A lot of people have been posting tips about here's a DIY project you can do. Here's some shows you can do. You can use Chrome to stream Netflix in a chat room with others, stuff like that. Myself, I'm still working 64 hours a week, so I haven't really had the opportunity to jump into any of those. But I wanted to mention this for those of you out there who are looking for a way to connect with others. And of course, you can jump into our Discord if you're on Patreon at the bottom $1 a month level. There's a lot of really good people in there. It's the best Discord chat channel, in my opinion, on the internet. So you can check that out as well. For my part, I just want to say, please make sure you're taking care of yourself, you're being careful, and staying healthy. Special thanks to our Patreon members who are supporting the show. I know times are hard right now, and your support means more than ever. I have no plans. I know I put a post up on Patreon for those of you who are on there, but I don't have any plans to suspend the show. There's some personal issues I'm dealing with. This whole situation has caused some mental health instability for myself, and also just some time restrictions as well. Even though I am working from home now, I'm doing more work than I would have if I wasn't. My son is out of school, so he's doing virtual school right now. There's a lot of stuff going on. So, for those who have continued to support the podcast on Patreon, you have my eternal gratitude. If you want to check it out, you can go to patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions, of course. For full transparency, I am recording this on March 22nd. So who knows? Maybe everything will be back to normal by the time this gets posted, but it seems like the projections are for a interruption of daily life for the foreseeable future. So I just want to say, for my part, I care about you. Try to remember to do the things that you know make you happy. Stick with your routines as much as you can, and please be compassionate. Watch out for others. Watch out for yourself. Take care of yourself. Compassion means taking care of yourself as well. And that's something I'm trying to do. And we can all get through this together. So as always, we will be back on the 16th. We're going to be returning with an interview with Nox Novacula. If you'd like to get early access to the episode, or even watch the live stream, get access to other stuff like that on Patreon, please do. I'm guessing that we'll have some post-show hangouts now. Like I mentioned, I can't necessarily start running my own live streams and hangouts just because of my life situation, but I think we're going to make some exceptions for spending some time in the chat for anyone who is available during the episode recording. So that's it. Thank you so much for spending time with me and hanging out this week. We will be back very soon. So until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.